On today's World Insight, we take an in-depth look at the unfolding U.S. Iran standoff. First, how has the crisis affected ties between Iran and its neighbors? Then, how has Europe reacted to the U.S. actions? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin today's show in the Middle East, where tensions between the U.S. and Iran keep on escalating. Iran launched missiles at bases housing U.S. troops in Iraq in retaliation for the U.S. killing of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. U.S. President Donald Trump then announced that he would strike back economically. Eyes across the world are now firmly on this region. Many say the current situation is a tinderbox on the verge of sparkling World War III even. Before we get down to the discussion about the latest situation, take a look at this.
Smoke of conflict rises in the Middle East. Less than 24 hours after Iraqi military installations housing American troops and coalition forces were hit, Trump announced the U.S. would immediately impose new sanctions on Iran.
As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior.
Trump used his address to speak directly to Iran, saying, "We want you to have a future, and a great future." He called on Iran to work with the U.S. in areas of common interest, including fighting ISIL. Iran's defense minister also gave a statement on Wednesday's attack.
Last night, tens of locally built missiles, our domestic short-range missiles, were used due to the distance with the targets. And for the first time since World War II, an important American base, which they said they had spent a lot of money on, was hit.
Missiles fired from Iranian territory struck the Ain al-Assad air base northwest of Baghdad in Iraq's Anbar province, and another U.S. military installation in Erbil also came under attack. This is Iran's revenge following last week's killing by the U.S. of one of Iran's most powerful figures, General Qasem Soleimani, in a drone strike in Baghdad. Amid growing insecurity, NATO announced it was moving some of its troops from Iraq to Jordan and Kuwait, while around 5,500 U.S. troops are still there to stay. Meanwhile, European attempts to salvage the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran are now hanging by a thread, after Tehran said it would no longer abide by the deal. And inside the U.S., Trump administration officials have failed to convince American lawmakers that an imminent threat justified the killing of Soleimani. This would force Trump to terminate military force in or against Iran, unless Congress has declared war or passed an authorization for the use of force against it.
For more on the Iran-U.S. standoff, we first take a look at how it is affecting the Middle East. In Tehran, we are joined by Ganbar Nadari, political analyst and columnist with Kayhan International newspaper. In Baghdad, we have Mazan El-Shaiker, who is an economist and independent politician. And in London, we are joined by Sahil Shah, policy fellow at the European Leadership Network, and originally coming from the Middle East. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go through some of the issues in the Middle East regarding the latest standoff between Iran and the United States. Mr. Nadari, with the latest threat of sanctions against Iran, or shall I say further sanctions against Iran from the U.S. president, what's likely to be the Iran's interaction as a result?
Definitely, Iran is going to escalate the situation from now on. There is no doubt about it. It is now a question of who gets to stay in Iraq. Obviously, it is not going to be the United States and its forces. We are going to see a lot of pressure on the part of the Iranian authorities, the Iranian government, and of course its counterparts in Iraq, especially lawmakers of the Iraqi parliament. They have already come up with a new law that urges the U.S. government to withdraw its troops from Iraq. So the stakes are high, not for Iran, but for the United States government. I am telling you with 100% confidence that Iran is going to increase its pressure through its proxy forces in the region to make sure that the U.S. government and its forces won't have any future in the region. This is a long march towards a long Cold War between these two rivals.
I see. Mr. Shah, from your perspective, how should we understand the practice made by the United States to assassinate a foreign leader, which is, of course, the very original incident that has sparked all of the latest?
Well, from the European perspective, they have to be very careful because it is now a tricky balancing act between trying to keep the U.S. in the fold as constructive and active of a participant in de-escalation as we can get them to be, while also standing firm and saying that what Trump has done has put European troops, citizens, and interests in the Middle East at risk. So there is a bit of a mixed reaction to the assassination, but overall, most policymakers have immediately pivoted to just simply trying to de-escalate the situation. Unfortunately, Europe has a very limited ability to change the calculus now in Washington, as well as Tehran. So hopefully tomorrow, when the EU convenes the 28 foreign ministers, we'll see some more cohesive and concerted action plans coming out of that meeting. But for right now, it seems as though everybody is running around trying to pick up the pieces.
But Mr. Shah, if I could, would the practice of assassinating a foreign leader be the one that the EU would support or the Europeans would support before the Europeans are being consulted? Meanwhile, is there any guarantee that practice will not be used by Washington again, even on the issue of the Middle East? Mr. Shah, briefly.
There is no guarantee that the United States will not continue, especially under this administration, to continue with targeted assassinations or killings. I think from the European perspective, you'll see a variety of views. Some will say that this is illegal and that he should be held to account for war crimes, whereas others, for example, like British officials here in London, they will more openly defend the action and say that the American argument that it was in self-defense stands. So there isn't one homogeneous opinion, and we should definitely pay attention to all.
Mr. Al-Shaiker, my question to you about Iraq, of course. Iraq has already agreed, both its parliament, its Security Council, and also its prime minister suggesting foreign troops should be moving out of Iraq. This applies to everyone, according to the Iraqi side. Do you see the prospect of implementation of this decision?
Well, thanks for the invite. First of all, the action that was taking place at the Iraqi parliament, it's questionable because it was a show of hands, and actually only 145 members of parliament voted for it. It requires 166. Of course, Iraq has 18 provinces. These members of parliament were only from, 7 or 8 provinces. This wasn't really a national movement, no. In the northern provinces and the western provinces, they weren't even there in parliament to show their opinion. So this is a one-sided opinion. As far as
so you're saying the parliament's decision is not a decision eligible for others, for Iraqis. Then what is the point of having a parliament?
Right, yeah. No. What I said is that it requires 166 votes in parliament to pass, but only 145 people voted for it. So there was a confusion about the exact number. No, of course, the parliament represents the people.
Okay,
I didn't
great.
say that. I was going to say also about the. I was also going to say about the confusion when people went out and demonstrated since October 1st until now, and they have sit-ins in about 16 cities. These are mostly people from Baghdad to Basra. They are, demonstrating against a government which is actually very, very close to Iran. They're against the government because the government is very corrupt. There's a lot of people who are confused that
you're not answering my question. My question to you is whether that will be implemented by other troops, foreign troops. I'm not asking you about whether your personal views about the government in Iraq. I'm asking you whether a decision made by the parliament and the current prime minister will be implemented by other troops in Iraq. What is your personal opinion? I understand you are having different views from your current administration. That's understandable because you're a politician. But on the other hand, what about a decision made by your country, whether that's going to be implemented or not? Sir, I hope I get my words clear, right?
Sure. It's very, very
Great.
clear.
Go ahead,
Actually, the Constitution states that a proposal by the executive power should be given to Parliament. So this was not a law, this was a resolution that was suggested to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is a caretaker government, so he cannot propose any laws. Therefore, we have to wait till the next election and the next Parliament before such a law can be implemented.
Okay, may I ask you, just for further information, when is the next Parliament and when is the next election, if your argument is so?
So the reason why the current Prime Minister submitted his resignation is so that a new Prime Minister, an independent Prime Minister, will be picked, and he will form a government, and within a year he will hold the next election.
Okay,
and that Parliament will be
the
one that's responsible
for
passing such a law.
Let me have Mr. Nadari to respond to that. Your Iraqi colleague certainly having a very different view from the current administration in Iraq, trying to suggest that that's not a decision likely to be implemented or adopted. What's your take?
Well, Iraq is a democratic country now, and the rule of law should prevail. We know very well that America doesn't mean business in the U.S. That is going to benefit the ordinary Iraqi people. It is there to divide and keep the country divided on sectarian lines. That's why it has occupied that country. That's why it has spent billions of dollars, as in the words of Trump, hundreds of billions of dollars to build military bases for its occupying forces. Obviously, the U.S. wants to stay there for a long, long time. That's why Iraqi lawmakers have come up with this new resolution. They know very well that America doesn't respect their sovereignty and the rule of law and or their self-determination. And they know that any kind of attack on Iraq's neighbors is going to make the situation worse than what it is now inside Iraqi territory. That's why they are not very concerned. That's why they are not happy to see America assassinate Iranian generals.
Okay.
Who knows what's going to happen next? We need to keep in mind that Iraq is a democratic country and a sovereign nation, and we should respect whatever its lawmakers decide with regard to their self-determination and their future.
All right.
America has to leave
if I could,
Iraq.
Mr. Nadari, if I could, it's not just about Iraq, it's also about the Iraq decision. If the U.S. does not withdraw from Iraq, will Iranian troops on the ground in Iraq do so?
There are no Iranian troops in Iraq.
Okay,
there are
great.
popular mobilization units, and these are Iraqi volunteer forces. And yes, Iran has some influence on them, but Iran doesn't have troops in Iraq at all.
Okay, Mr. Shah, you heard your colleagues from both Iraq and Iran. Certainly, inside the Middle East, there are so many divisions, including the ones that we mentioned and we heard from the two gentlemen as well. But there is another issue, which is the U.S. role in the Middle East, particularly on the issue of Iraq and also the latest crisis to Iran. But those are not necessarily the same thing. One is among those from the Middle East. The other is the U.S. role over there in the region. Mr. Shah, what do you make of these two different sets of questions?
I think that the U.S. role in the Middle East has been tried and tested for a number of years now and largely has failed to be a constructive presence. I'm not surprised by the potentially valid, potentially invalid Iraqi vote to get U.S. forces out. And I'm not surprised that Iran will now very easily capitalize on what the reaction has been in Iraq to try to get the U.S. out of not just Iraq, but the wider region. You know, the United States has had many opportunities to promote peace and stability, but it's chosen at many different ventures to meddle in processes that they themselves wanted to make into inclusive democratic processes, and thus it seems as though the United States doesn't necessarily live up to the principles that it would like to, you know, see the region exhibit. And I'm talking about democratic principles. So the United States definitely needs to respect whatever decisions are made in terms of the consequences of what it has done by killing General Qasem Soleimani and by ripping up the nuclear deal and you know, emboldening tensions in the region.
My final question for the three of you, because I know some of you might leave our discussion a bit later. Our memory, if we could, from the 21st century, started from the war in Iraq in the year 2003, with the suggestion of weapons of mass destruction, which did not eventually turn out to be the case. Then we have so-called revolutions in the Middle East, with several countries running into some problems. And then we are also having later the Iran nuclear issue. Some suggest it's already having certain fruits before it run down again as a result of certain countries withdrawing from the treaty. And now we have the Iran-U.S. crisis, apparently. So, gentlemen, if you look at chronologically over the past 15 years or so, what do you make of the nature of this and what's next? If we could have both of you, Mr. Nadari and Mr. Shah, to speak. My producer telling me the Iraqi guest has been having some difficulties listening to the question. So let me get to you, Mr. Nadari, briefly.
Tianwei, make no mistake, if Iran is pushed into a corner, if the U.S. government doesn't return to the JCPOA, and if Iran doesn't see the economic benefits of the nuclear deal with the help of the European signatories to the deal, which is the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, I give you my assurances that Iran is going to speed up even further, rolling back its nuclear commitments under the JCPOA, and we are going to enter an uncharted territory. We don't know what's going to happen next, but if Iran needs a nuclear deterrence, it will walk towards that deterrence, because if international civil society doesn't help Iran to protect its economy and sovereignty, I'm afraid that is the path for Iran, which is not going to make anybody happy.
Okay, Mr. Shah, your take. Same question.
So in terms of the JCPOA or the nuclear deal, I think that we all have to be very cautious about rendering it completely dead at the moment, because Iran has been very wise to still allow inspections under the JCPOA to continue. They're still voluntarily implementing the IAEA additional protocol, and they're still a member state to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a cornerstone to the entire non-proliferation regime. So what Iran has done is has gifted us by restraining itself with not taking more, overt military action, and actually has given some breathing room now that both sides have shown their military muscle to potentially negotiate a pathway out of this. What we have to definitely keep in mind is that the United States cannot do that alone. It does not have the capacity, and it does not have the interest to do it. Thus, Europe, Russia, and China, they must quickly forge a path together now to come up with a creative proposal that gets Iran and the U.S. to at least utilize 2020 to ease the economic restraints that have been put on Iran quite unfairly, and create the room for these other topics that weren't included in the JCPOA to at least be more openly and constructively discussed.
All right.
However, it requires U.S. complicity.
Okay. We're running out of time. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Sahil, Shah, and Gambar Nadri. Also, we would like to express our appreciation for the earlier appearance of our Iraqi guest, Mr. Al Shaker. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. You are watching World Inside, the program coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come, Trump calls upon Europe to get tough on Iran. Can Europe persuade Trump to stand down? That is a question coming from both sides. We're going to have our guests from both sides to speak about that issue.
As long as I'm President of the United States.
This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's continue our focus on Iran-U.S. tensions. Although Trump says the lack of U.S. casualties in Iran attacks signals de-escalation, tensions between the two countries has not yet ceased. Meanwhile, further abroad, European leaders are anxious to avoid more conflict. Listen to this.
I think that now is the time to engage in dialogue. We will discuss this on Friday with the EU foreign ministers, but we will also talk with all those involved on all sides, and everyone should now do what they can to ensure restraint is practiced so that this situation can be de-escalated and that diplomatic solutions can be found.
We want to de-escalate the tensions. We are concerned that if we see a full-blown war, it would be very damaging, and actually the terrorists, in particular Daesh, would be the only winners.
Despite the diplomatic efforts, the European states also have one eye on their interests in the Middle East. Germany is moving some of its 120 troops out of Iraq as a precaution, with London and Paris also said to be weighing up contingency plans. All eyes are now firmly on Iran and how it will respond to a killing that's been felt right at the core of the Islamic Republic. Meanwhile, they're also looking at the U.S., what's likely to be the internal fighting going on between the two parties regarding Iran issue. So how is the Iran-U.S. standoff affecting ties between the U.S. and Europe? In Washington, we are joined by Paulo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute. That's a public policy Research Institute. In Bonn, Germany, we are joined by Joseph Yanning, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have both of you. Let me ask you, Mr. Yanning, this time the killing, assassination of Iranian army general has not been consulting the European side and took the latter by surprise. Do you think that practice will continue between Washington and Brussels and Washington and various European capitals?
Well, Chen Wei, it seems to me that at this point both sides are interested in not escalating the conflict. Both sides are sending signals that they would refrain from further action in order to control the risk of an outbreak of a larger scale war. So at this point, at least, there is a certain easing of the tensions. But when you look around European capitals, they are not certain that this will hold. It can break away any time, either by some action by some militia associated with Iran that will then trigger another U.S. response. So the crisis is far from being over.
But Mr. Yanning, if I could repeat my question, which you didn't answer directly, and I'm not smart enough to figure out exactly what you meant. My question really is whether the Europeans are accepting the fact that the Americans, particularly Washington and the current administration, are going to do further escalation of the tensions, including killing foreign generals or foreign officials without consulting the European capitals. Mr. Yanning, is that acceptable?
Well, for the Europeans, the question is not whether it's acceptable to them. They have to live with what the United States do. Whenever the U.S. government considers something to be in its important or vital interest, it does not consult its allies as much as they would wish to be consulted, to be in a dialogue, as Europeans never stop to emphasize. So this is something that they have come to accept as a reality, even though as a reality that they do not really appreciate.
Okay, Mr. Mr. Yanning, another question from the European perspective. Now, the Europeans are having some troops inside the Middle East. Meanwhile, the European capitals are all having your embassies in the Middle East, various countries. And at the same time, there are peacekeeping forces, which include European citizens in the region as well. Mr. Yanin, are the Europeans ready to accept the result and the consequences of the earlier interactions between Iran and the United States as a result of the assassination of an Iranian military general? Mr. Yanin.
As far as I can see, Tianwei, European governments are quite aware of the exposure they have due to their presence in the region. And you can rely on the fact that all principal capitals are now doing contingency planning in order to reduce that risk. Very early on, for example, the Germans have relocated some of their personnel to Jordan and have made sure that in case of an Iranian retaliation to the killing of the general, the harm to German soldiers stationed in Iraq as on a training mission is under control. And that will continue. We will see that Europeans will continue to be in the region and stay in the region as long and as much as they can because of their own interest, but they are quite aware of the increased risk that they are running.
Mr. Chirac, thank you for your patience waiting while I'm interacting with your European colleague. I'm sure you heard it very clearly. So what would that mean? Yes. This incident from the killing of the Iraqi general to what is now and to what the responses have been, Mr. Yanin mentioned earlier, for the transatlantic relationship?
Well, look, this is quite complicated. Obviously, the killing, the order from the highest level, it's quite clear this came personally from Mr. Trump to order the airstrike that led to the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. Caught everybody by surprise. Rumor is that people at the Pentagon had no idea that this had been authorized. So people at the highest level of government were not in the loop, so to speak, about what's going to be the American action, that eventually led to the killing of Soleimani. So let alone, consulting with others, with the opposition in Congress, who were obviously not consulted, the Democrats, other representatives of the Senate and the House, and certainly not our European allies, which is a shame. But I really think, as your other guest pointed out, that be that as it may, when America believes that its supreme national interest is at stake, it just acts and informs people later. This is not optimal for a smooth running of an alliance that has been around since 1949. I'm referring to NATO. But that's kind of the way it is. It's suboptimal, for sure.
Mr. von Schirach, I heard very clearly about your explanation earlier that might be one member of the administration that has made the decision without consulting all the others. And you could also say the war power probably is with the president, at least for the assassination of a foreign general. But Mr. von Schirach, the United States is the United States. It's not about one person. The decision being made by one person is already the decision being made by a state, because that is exactly the result. So the complicated, sophisticated understanding of Washington is necessary, but the consequences of that is made by the United States. So Mr. von Schirach, how do you see that issue once and again being demonstrated over the past few years?
Well, look, again, that's kind of the way it is. Obviously, if the president decides something, he is, according to the Constitution, the commander-in-chief. There is no doubt, although there's been some debate here in the United States. I won't get into that because it gets really technical. Some people argued that President Trump did not have the constitutional authority, the legal authority, to order this strike. Other people say, no, he has it because he's a commander-in-chief. There is an emergency, and he has taken action, according to his assessment, to prevent a major attack against the United States. That's the official line. So obviously this action binds the United States because this is the President of the United States. I don't know that there is always a debate here in the United States as to who has power. And it's quite clear that the Constitution says that the Congress, and only the Congress, has the power to declare war. But this is short of a declaration of war.
Okay. Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? We have seen the ripple effects reacted in so many different levels, whether it's the Middle East or inside the U.S., Washington, or on a bigger scale. What about the Iranian nuclear deal? About that, we are having, once again, Mr. von Schirach and Mr. Yanning staying with us. Meanwhile, we are joined once again back by Mr. Ganbar Nadari from Iran, as well as Mr. Joe Rong joining us new here from Beijing, a senior analyst from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, let me continue about that. JCPOA, an agreement already made, but now U.S. withdrew earlier, which led to all of this drama. And what's next? The Iranians are leaving some space there. So, Mr. Yanning, do you think the Europeans might want to remind your American counterpart that there is still a window opportunity, Mr. Yanning?
Well, Europeans have made it clear these days again that they do not intend to follow the United States in leaving the JCPOA. As much as the President has called on them to do so, they have responded by saying, no, we will not. We will stick to that agreement. And indeed, they will try to also keep Iran committed to that agreement, as difficult as it has become. Europe themselves does not have additional means available to present new incentives or new reasons for Iran to stay, other than not to walk away from the one cooperative track that exists between Iran and the West. So that's where we stand from a European perspective at this point.
But what about for you, Mr. Nadari, hearing that response from your European counterpart?
Well, Tianwei, on Saturday morning, I'm going to meet the spokesman of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, during which he's going to announce officially that Iran will continue to take the fifth step and scale back fully its commitments under the JCPOA. This clearly means that there will be no more limitations on Iran's nuclear activities. And that is a very, very dangerous path. And that is precisely what the officials here have decided to take. I think the European signatories should take these threats very, very seriously, because if something happens, it is not just Iran that is going to be blamed, but the European signatories, because unlike Russia and China, they did absolutely nothing to save the deal. We know that they are under immense pressure from the United States, and they are still refusing to do trade with Iran, even in their own currencies. I mean, what is wrong with doing trade with Iran in your own currencies? They even refuse to do that. So they have no one to blame but themselves. But as I told you earlier, Iran is going to walk into an uncharted territory from Saturday morning, and that is going to be announced officially by the spokesman of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, during which I am also attending.
Got it, Mr. Nadari. Now to Beijing, Mr. Zhou. You heard your colleagues from around the world talking about the latest situation and the logic behind their reactions and their insights for the potential. Mr. Zhou, China is not necessarily a direct party involved, and yet about JCPOA, China was, and China still is. So how will China get involved in this? To what degree? Particularly, there is a tricky relationship now with Washington.
I think China may continue its cooperation with Iran, no matter whether Washington is happy or not. But I don't really think the crisis between Iran and America may influence the trade relations between China and the United States. On the other hand, I think I understand Mr. Adnan was very angry with the Europeans' counterpart, which they did not just do anything for Iran. But I'm sure between Europe and Iran. They still have the dialogue channel. They will still discuss about the future item, how to guarantee JCPOA. And I'm sure that anger is one thing, but actually sometimes Iran look to European country rather than they look to Russia and China.
Which, of course, they understand the sophistication of relationship between the Europeans and also the United States.
They understand.
All right.
But I also think that they should, sometimes they overestimate Europeans' ability, because one of the European colleagues just said their influence over America is limited.
Okay.
So they have to calculate about that.
Having said that, though, let me go to you, Mr. von Schirach. It seems that your three other colleagues, I know you're not representing the U.S. government, of course, but only from an analyst perspective. You know, your other three colleagues have been suggesting, well, there seems to be a possibility that we go ahead without the U.S. participation. Iran likely to in an uncharted territory, the Europeans also in an uncharted territory, continuing this interaction with Iran without the U.S. even joining at all, even in the future even. So, Mr. von Schirach, is the U.S. ready for a JCPOA and a continuation of this process without its participation? And a case study and probably a precedent being set, if that will be the case, for other issues which also the U.S. might have an interest in. Mr. von Schirach.
Well, look, obviously this is extremely complicated, and the whole world knows the position of the President of the United States from day one. This was not a mystery. Even when he was campaigning for president, Mr. Trump indicated that he was against the deal struck by his predecessor, President Obama, and Secretary of State John Kerry. So this is no mystery, and this has been whatever the inconsistencies and the strange behavior, erratic behavior attributed to Mr. Trump, this has been remarkably consistent. Like it or not, I'm not saying I approve or I disapprove. I'm just saying this is the way it is.
But you know,
and
my question
frankly,
is not about your president. My question is whether the United States as a whole, you already are trying to help us to understand the sophisticated structures of the U.S. government, saying the Congress and the political parties and this and that. So now I'm having a question about that. Is the United States as a whole, including its different branches of the government, going to accept the fact that there is likely to be a precedent being set? To what degree, I don't know, but an international treaty without the United States being an important participant of it, which also this treaty will have a tremendous impact on the U.S. relationship in the Middle East and the U.S. security issue as well, Mr. von Schirach. That is the question I'm asking.
Okay, very good question. Of course, as you know, we're having an election in November of this year. It's still a few months away, but not an interminable period of time. The former Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, who was very intimately involved in the negotiations leading to the nuclear deal, gave a speech a couple of days ago saying that what Mr. Trump did was a complete disaster, and that clearly he, if elected president, would go back essentially and try to reconstruct, if possible.
So what are you trying to say?
From this disaster. I'm trying to say that if a Democrat gets elected president, most likely we will see America stepping back from the complete opposition to the current deal, and that something will be done. I'm not sure if it's going to be the same deal that was concluded under the supervision of President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry, but there will be an agreement to try to reconstruct some kind of negotiated solution to this problem with Iran, the Europeans, China, and Russia.
Okay, Mr. Zhou. Is
if
everybody else, Mr. Zhou, ready to accept a United States turning its decisions back and forth every 4 years? Maybe in 4 years there's another election and another turning around of the earlier decision. Can Iranian nuclear issue go like that?
I think that's a very interesting question, Ms. Tianwei. But interesting things, you see, there's no such a president like Donald Trump. You see,
Well, never say those words too early, sir.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
probably what
yeah,
we have
of course.
learned from the election.
But actually, I'm a little bit optimistic, as I said yesterday.
Okay.
That is the new, when new election comes, then if Democratic come to power, something may change. What we say that is they use their soft power rather than hard power.
All right.
To challenge
well,
Iran.
elections is very hard for all of us from outside the U.S. to figure out exactly how it's going. I'm not an expert about that. Mr. Yanning, what about for you? Every 4 years is a change of the Iranian nuclear issue?
Well, that's of course very unfortunate. It used to be the case that we said pacta sunt servanda, treaties are to be observed. But when you have these twists and turns in politics, you don't know. This actually is something that cannot be taken for granted anymore. As unfortunate as it is, we will have to live with the discontinuity of these agreements.
You will have to live, that is a word being said by Mr. Yanning, with the reality. Mr. Nadari, is that reality acceptable to the Iranians? Briefly.
Not at all. Iran is not willing to negotiate or renegotiate the nuclear deal with the U.S. government, any other government. It doesn't matter if it is Trump or another president. At the same time, you made an absolutely perfect point when you mentioned that U.S. doesn't need to return to the nuclear deal, but at the same time, it could allow other signatories to do business with Iran in order to save this important deal, which, by the way, has been ratified by the UN Security Council, Tianwei. I think we don't need the U.S. if other signatories help Iran see the economic benefits of this important agreement.
Okay, we're running out of time, gentlemen. Mr. Nadari from Iran, Mr. Von Chirac coming from France. You could have the four of them once again on our screen. And Mr. Yanning coming from Germany. Last but not least, Mr. Zhou from China. Really appreciate it, gentlemen, for your insights. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter and Facebook accounts. I'm Tian Wei. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Thank you, sir.